Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what shadow integration really means and how to actually integrate your shadow. So a common question that I get from my viewers, my students, and my clients is what shadow integration really means and how practically do we know if we've actually integrated an aspect and how to actually go about doing that. And I'll be explaining all of that in depth in this video, but first let me give a quick definition of what the shadow is and what shadow work is. So what the shadow is it's basically the place in the unconscious where we put parts of ourselves to repress them and forget about them and to go unconscious to them. And what shadow work is and shadow integration is the process of bringing those parts of ourselves up out of the shadow and into the light of consciousness and coming to reincorporate them into the conscious personality. And shadow work is any practice that you're using to become more conscious of these parts of yourself and to integrate these parts of yourself. So shadow work is a pretty broad umbrella. Now, what shadow integration really functionally means, in a nutshell, is that you are re-becoming an aspect of yourself that you used to be, but that you pushed away and now can't access so easily. So to illustrate this more clearly, I'm going to give a personal example of a shadow aspect that I'm working on integrating myself right now. So when I was a child, I was very sensitive and joy came very easily to me. And I found that I was a lot more sensitive than my peers, and I would get excited about things a lot more than my peers. At least this was my perception. And I sort of had that reflected back to me many times where, let's say they were just a little bit more cool, a little bit more collected, but I would be kind of like all over the place with myself with joy and excitement if something positive came up, or like I would be very fearful if I were fearful. So there was like this emotional intensity that I had at the time. And oftentimes, like up until I was like 12 or 13, I was called annoying, and I got a lot of negative social consequences as a result of just being a very expressive and very emotional kid. And what ended up happening is that when I was about 12 or 13, I learned how to very successfully start to suppress my emotions and how to come across as kind of dispassionate, kind of apathetic, kind of a flat in a way. And that's still something that I tend to express myself that way. So I feel like I'm not fully integrated with this aspect. That's why I'm working on it right now. But before, there was such negative social consequences there, and it really caused me to not fit in. And so what I've done is I've kind of turned down the dial on my emotional sensitivity, and I've kind of become a bit more flat in the way that I express myself. And so I have this part of myself now that's down in the shadow. So let's just call this aspect like excitable emerald, right? So excitable emerald was just my default mode. I was that, that was part of me. It was part of my personality. But I pushed that away pretty successfully by the time I was about 10 or 11, 12 or so. And so with this excitable emerald aspect, what the process of re-becoming that aspect or reintegrating that aspect would be almost like I'm stepping back into that part of myself from the first person perspective. Right now, I'm thinking about that from a third person. I'm thinking about it kind of at a distance where it's like, okay, I know there's an aspect of me that is excitable, but there's still a distance. What integration means is actually being able to step back into that perspective and just have that be part of my personality. And so functionally, that's what integration really means in simplest terms. So that's what integration is, but equally important is to understand what integration is not. So the first misconception that I find people thinking about integration is that because the shadow tends to be associated with certain negative qualities, what the integration doesn't mean is just expressing those negative qualities. In fact, you don't have to express anything negative or detrimental to you or anyone else to integrate your shadow. And in fact, if your shadow aspect is expressing any kind of detrimental qualities or negative qualities, then chances are that's a coping mechanism that actually sits on top of the actual shadow aspect. For example, let's say that someone has trouble with greedy behavior, and so they see that as part of their shadow, and maybe they try to suppress it, but they're generally just aware that sometimes they can be a bit greedy, and so they're like, oh, I don't like that, I think that's part of my shadow. And very likely it is part of the symptoms of the shadow, but because that person would be conscious of their greed, it wouldn't necessarily be a shadow in and of itself. And so what they'd have to do is they'd have to look at that greed and they'd have to say, okay, where is that coming from? And maybe they find a part of themselves that's been split off from the rest of the personality and put in the shadow because it was dealing with scarcity in some way. Could be something like scarcity of food, or something physical, or it could be a more emotional scarcity, like scarcity of love, scarcity of connection, scarcity of validation. And now it's manifested itself as greedy behavior. But the shadow aspect and integrating the shadow aspect doesn't have to do with expressing that greed. It's about becoming aware of that greed and then exploring it to its deepest root and saying, oh, there's this really vulnerable part of myself. How can I connect to that part? How can I feel the emotions that this part is feeling from in the shadow? How can I make that part more conscious to me and reincorporate that more vulnerable part into my personality through working through that trauma, through meeting the needs that that aspect has? So that's one of them. So shadow integration doesn't mean expressing the negative qualities of your shadow aspects. Shadow integration also doesn't mean, and this is another misconception that I find is very common, where a person just becomes aware of an aspect. So sometimes it's the case that, whenever we're repressing an aspect, whenever we experience a trigger or, something of that nature, our shadow aspect can actually pop up above the surface in certain circumstances. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're ready to integrate that aspect. We can become aware of aspects without being ready to integrate them. For example, when I was 20 years old, I was repressing quite a lot of myself because I was trying to build a very, very specific identity for myself. And so I was identified with this persona, and anything that didn't fit within that persona, I was trying to push away. So I had some pretty extreme repressions, pretty extreme shadow, and it was very unsustainable. And it happened to be that that year was the first time that I tried plant medicine. And so I had tried ayahuasca at that point in time. And under the influence of the ayahuasca, I basically really let go of that identity that I had been holding on to very tightly. And almost immediately, like a time lapse. So it normally takes a long time actually to work through everything you need to work through to integrate your shadow aspects. And so you don't usually see it in such a time lapse, but it was like an immediate, like almost like if you could watch a time lapse of a flower grow. This was my experience of the time lapse of the shadow integrating. So it was almost like I immediately let go of my identity, I became detached from ego, and then all of a sudden, all of these parts of myself that I had gone unconscious to, that I'd been pushing away, were now suddenly up at the surface, and I felt totally incorporated and whole with those aspects. I felt totally in a state of integration during that experience. But then of course the ayahuasca wore off, and then I went on about my business, but I had, started to come back to my default mode, started to re-identify with the things that I was identified with. And now I was conscious of all of these parts of myself that I'd pushed away that came up in that experience, but now I didn't have the identity or the worldview that I needed to be able to integrate those parts of myself. And so it really created this intense struggle. And so instead of like this like homecoming and this like reintegration experience, it was almost like I had popped a bubble and now all of my demons came out of it. And it was so hard to actually get to the point where I was able to expand my identity and expand my worldview enough to incorporate those parts of myself. And it took years after that experience to do that. And so it's very important to keep in mind that you can become aware of your shadow aspects, and you can have a full-blown experience of becoming aware of and integrating your shadow aspects. And if you haven't primed yourself enough to be able to integrate them, then that's going to probably cause more harm than good. And so what I would recommend is always take the shadow integration process very gently and very gradually, because you want to gradually open yourself up more and more to that integration, because just becoming conscious of a part of yourself doesn't mean that you're ready to integrate it. So to illustrate this a little bit, like let's say that this is the conscious personality, and let's say you have some kind of trigger or some kind of experience like the one I had with ayahuasca, and basically all of this stuff comes up above the surface, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can integrate. And so you have maybe now these warring elements of the self if you can't integrate it. But what integration is basically where you can fully intertwine your conscious personality with these parts that you've disowned. And when you can do that, you can come back into a state of wholeness, like where there is no sense of separation and there is no sense of conflict there. All right, so in just a moment, I'm going to be talking to you practically about how to integrate your shadow aspects. But first, I wanted to mention that my husband, Richard Kodai, has a movie out for pre-order on Apple TV and iTunes called Room Zero. And so he wrote it himself, he directed it, he edited it, and he produced it, and he got distribution for it through a company called Gravitas Ventures. And so it's out on Apple TV and iTunes on I think it's either March 18th or March 19th. And so right now is the pre-order period. And what we're hoping to do is we're hoping to get him to rank in the top 10 on Apple TV, and that will just depend on how many pre-orders he gets and how many orders he gets the same day that his movie is released. And so I'm putting it out here to give him the best possible chances of hitting that bar. And it's definitely, I can't share the exact number, but it's definitely a bar that's easy to hit. And so we really want to make sure that he has the best possible chances of doing that. And so I'm offering a complimentary 30-minute coaching session, one-on-one with me. If you, let's say, go on Apple TV or iTunes and pre-order his movie, just send me the receipts at the diamondnetchannel@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to put you on my schedule. And thank you in advance to anyone who pre-orders his movie. It really means a lot to me, and it means a lot to him. And so yes, any support with that, I'd be most grateful for. All right, so practically, let's talk about how to integrate a shadow aspect. And it's really quite simple because it's more of a subtractive process than an additive process. What you have to do is you have to resolve that aspect's reason for repression. And there tends to be 4 primary reasons for that repression, which I'll get into in just a moment. But before I get into those 4 reasons for repression and how to work through those reasons for repression, what I want to do is I want to really drive home the importance of really working with the shadow and not working against it. One of the misconceptions that I find that people have when it comes to working with the shadow is they almost look like the shadow, like it's a dragon that needs to be slayed. Now I'm going to fight the shadow and I'm going to integrate these parts of myself and I'm going to, so sometimes it can be a very combative thing, but really you want to work with the shadow. What you have to understand is that the shadow is an ancient psychological technology in the same way that all of our bodily organs are a kind of ancient technology. So in the same way that our heart is an organ of the body and it has this deep wisdom to it in terms of knowing how to keep pumping the blood in exactly the right way, the shadow is exactly the same way. So our shadow from the unconscious, it knows what to put in the shadow and it knows what to give back to the light of consciousness. And it does this in ways that it knows better than the conscious mind about. So in the same way that the heart knows how to pump blood and the lungs know how to breathe, the shadow knows how to comport yourself psychologically, and it knows it far better than you do as the conscious mind. And the shadow has a very important function to play, and it plays that function very, very well. And that function is to help you cope and even thrive despite the fact that you're experiencing suboptimal situations. So that means that you can experience a whole lot of trauma without it totally taking you out of the game. And you can experience a whole lot of unmet needs and still be able to continue moving on about your day. So the shadow is absolutely a survival mechanism, and it's a very effective survival mechanism that's been stress tested over thousands and thousands of generations of human beings. And the shadow is designed to help you cope through very, very, very difficult situations. And it does this by making you unconscious to parts of yourself that have bore the brunt of particular traumas or are dealing with unmet needs, or that there's just an inability to be conscious of that part of yourself at a given time. So I want you to keep this in mind, that when an aspect of yours has been repressed, there's probably a very, very good reason why that aspect is repressed. It's not that the shadow made a mistake or that the psyche made a mistake. It's that consciously you want to integrate this part, but then the shadow knows that, ooh, you're not ready to integrate this part yet. You're not able to face with the intensity of that emotion. And basically it's very wise in terms of what it decides to sort into the shadow versus what it allows to be up above the surface of consciousness and integrated into your personality. And this is why it's incredibly important to work with your shadow, because it is incredibly wise and it understands your psychology a lot more than you do, and it understands your limits a lot more than you do. And so it's really important to work with the wisdom of the shadow and to meet its requirements for giving you back one of your aspects to the light of consciousness. And so to do that, you have to unwire the reason for repression in the first place. And once you actually work through the reason why an aspect was repressed in the first place, the shadow is going to happily give you back that aspect to your conscious awareness, and you can integrate that aspect quite easily. So as I had mentioned before, there are 4 main reasons why aspects of ourself end up in the shadow, and I had made actually a whole entire video about this called the 4 reasons for repression, and you can go and you can look back in my videos to check that out. And basically these 4 reasons are we repress parts to preserve an identity. We also do so to preserve a worldview. We also repress parts of ourselves to cope with trauma and to cope with unmet needs. And so basically, we can have a shadow aspect that's repressed for 1 of these reasons, 2 of these reasons, 3 of these reasons, or all 4 of these reasons. And so if we have a specific shadow aspect that we're trying to integrate, we have to work through every single one of these reasons that applies. Now I have 4 things to go through, and so I'm going to give you just the bare bones within this video. But if you want to check out more about these 4 reasons for repression, I highly recommend checking out my video. All right, so let's look first into identity-based barriers to integration. So that means that these are things that are meant to preserve our ego, to preserve our identity, to basically keep ourselves from becoming aware of things that undermine the way that we think about ourselves. And to prime yourself for this, you want to get to a point where you're okay with holding space for uncertainty and ambiguity. If you have a very strong sense of, I need to know myself exactly who I am and how I am, and you have a very, very tight grasp on that, then that's going to be something that's going to get in the way of like almost suspending connection or attachment to those identities. But basically, you want to do 2 main things here. Is 1, you want to start getting a distance from your preferences and your qualities to where you're not hyper-identifying with them, but to where you can just recognize certain things about yourself that are true. Like, so for example, I can recognize that, okay, I'm a kind of an intuitive person. I like to function intuitively. I could recognize this about myself. And it's just sort of noticing a quality versus identifying with that thing and saying, oh yes, I'm the intuitive person and I'm like this and I'm not like that. So there's a big difference between, let's say, holding on very, very tightly to an identity of being intuitive, for example, than just noticing a quality. And so you can notice qualities about yourself, but to have like sort of a distance from those qualities and not being so tightly held on to a self-concept. And another thing you would want to do to work through identity-based barriers to integration is you want to get comfortable with seeing the opposite of positive qualities within yourself that you identify with. So for example, if I hyper-identify with being good, for example, then I have to become comfortable with recognizing the parts of myself that I label bad. And if I label myself as strong, I have to get comfortable with loving and accepting the parts of myself that I've labeled as weak. Or if I identify with myself with being serious, then I have to get comfortable with accepting the parts of myself that I consider unserious and frivolous. Or if I identify with being unique, then I want to get used to coming to connect with the parts of myself that I consider common or ordinary. And so one of the main things that you can do when it comes to working through identity-based barriers to integration is to hold space for all things and their opposite within yourself and outside of yourself. All right, so the second reason why we push parts of ourself into the shadow is to preserve a particular worldview. So when it comes to worldview-based barriers to integration, what we want to do is we want to acknowledge the fact that our worldview, we hold on to it very strongly because it is the foundation for our identity. And so identity-based barriers to repression and worldview-based barriers to repression go hand in hand. For example, if I'm the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, there's a whole cosmology that identity clicks into. And so if I'm very, very strongly identified with being the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, then somebody comes along, let's say somebody comes from Greece and they have a totally different pantheon and a totally different worldview, that's going to feel very threatening because if their worldview undermines mine, it totally undermines my identity and the entire way that I see myself. And so in order to dissolve worldview-based barriers to repression, you also want to embrace uncertainty and recognize that you don't know anything for sure. And that's true when it comes to your own identity as well, but then also your worldview. By allowing parts of yourself to come in to be integrated that might counteract with the way you see the world. So for example, if I have a worldview that everybody who's strong is good and worthy and everyone who's weak is bad and unworthy, if I have a really, really rigid view like that and I'm very held on to that viewpoint, then it's going to be very, very difficult for me to integrate parts of myself that are weak, because it's like, oh no, the whole entire, cosmology that I'm operating off of invalidates those parts of myself. And so there are two questions that I would recommend asking yourself to start working at getting some distance from your worldview and starting to get that ability to have a more breathable worldview. And so that is to ask yourself, if my worldview, or if this cherished belief that I have happened to be untrue, how would that make me feel about myself? How would that make me feel about my identity? Or if I say, what about the opposite belief to my viewpoint? If the opposite belief to this particular belief were true, then what would that do for me in my identity? How would that feel? So for example, let's say that I have a strong belief in my worldview that people are fundamentally good at their core. And let's say if I said, okay, well, if that weren't true, how would I feel about myself? And it's like, oh, well, maybe that opens the door that I'm not good. And maybe that sort of makes me feel like this part of myself that I've repressed because I think it's bad might come up to the surface and invalidate me in some way. Or if the opposite belief were true, that, oh, people are fundamentally evil, then it's almost like, oh no, now there's a sense of invalidity based off of the fact that there's this core nature of evil that I can't get away from. So I can think about those worldviews in relation to my identity by asking those two questions. All right, so the third reason why we repress parts of ourself into the shadow is to cope with trauma. What a trauma is from the perspective of the nervous system is when we experience an event that produces emotions that are too intense to be processed by the nervous system. And so what that means is it could be very intensely positive emotions or intensely negative emotions, and even a mixture of both of those can come into play. But basically what happens with traumas is that if we have emotions that are too intense to process, the nervous system basically shuts down the processing of those emotions and holds them in the body. And then on the level of the psyche, what happens is that we split off part of ourself that bore the brunt of whatever that traumatic event was that produced those intense emotions and push that away into the shadow and into the unconscious. So on the level of the body, I've now gone unconscious to whatever emotions are hanging out there in the nervous system. And also the part of myself that bore the brunt of those experiences that produced those emotions is now been cut off from the rest of my consciousness and pushed into the shadow. And so what I would want to do if I want to integrate this part of myself that's been pushed away is I want to start feeling into the body on a very somatic, physical level. So emotions come up as sensations in the body. They're literal electrical impulses that move through the nervous system. So emotions aren't imaginary in any kind of way. There's something that happens in the body. And so what I want to do is I want to bring my focus and attention down to those emotions on the level of the body. And let's say I have emotions that are unprocessed that are hanging out here in the chest. And I want to just focus on that. And the more that I shine the light of my own awareness on it, the more that those emotions are able to process. And the more that I'm able to to process and let go of those emotions, the closer and closer in proximity I get to this part of myself. And actually, I can share a personal experience of this from one of my medicine journeys. So basically, this was back in 2022, and I do a medicine journey every spring at an ayahuasca church that's close to me. And so I had gone into the ceremony, and the medicine was working, and I happened to lay down. And my behind the eyes visual were lots of like geometric shapes were coming up. And it was like the medicine was encouraging me to kind of look at the geometric shapes. And then it was also having me focus in my jaw, my face, and my neck kind of region. And I basically have a lot of tension in these areas of the body. And I've also had like chronic experiences with fear quite a lot. And so what it was doing is it was basically driving all of my fear up to the surface, and it was making me sit directly with the sensation of fear. And so what I was recognizing is that what fear actually were these shapes of tension that were sitting in the body. And it was showing it to me as certain geometric shapes. So I was feeling the physical, element of the fear, which were shapes of tension in the body. And then I was seeing like a visual representation of what I was experiencing physically in the form of geometric shapes. And so visually in the behind the eyes visual, I was having to focus on that fear in shape form, but then on the level of the body, having to focus on the sensation in sensation form. And as I was doing that, what was happening is that each little shape would only take about 2 seconds to process, and it would pass through my line of sight and sort of come through where I was focusing on in the body, and then that shape would be done processing, and then another shape would be done processing, and so on and so on. And this happened maybe about 30 times over with these different shapes of tension and fear. And then what happened is I then started to connect into this part of myself that felt very much 3 years old, and it felt terrified. And so it was like if you could imagine that a 3-year-old was lost in the woods and felt totally overwhelmed. And there was just this sense of intense overwhelm. And then it gave me this memory. It wasn't a repressed memory, but there were elements of it that I didn't remember. And when I was very small, I used to really look up to my mom, and I'd really idolize my mom. And basically what had happened is that it brought me into this memory from when I was about 3 years old, where I had gone underneath the bathroom sink and I got my mom's makeup pouch out, and I took out her lipstick and I basically smeared it all over my face. And it's something I remember doing. I remember it. And other, like my mom and my dad would be like, oh, remember that one time Emerald got into the lipstick, when she was little, So it wasn't a repressed memory per se. But what I didn't remember about that memory is the reason why I was going to do it. And what I was trying to do is I was trying to be like my mom. And at the time, I had this impression that my mom was perfect, like she was the image of perfection. And I felt like I had to match up to her image of perfection, otherwise it would totally invalidate everything about myself. And so there was this constant fear of having to be perfect and having to do all the scary things alone as a result of, wanting to be perfect. And it was like this scary sense of I have to be exactly like my mom to be perfect. But I look more like my dad than I look like my mom. And so I was trying to look like my mom in order to emulate perfection. But it was a sense that if I wasn't perfect, that it would totally invalidate myself. And so it was this intense fear. It's almost like if you could imagine living on the blade of the knife, and if you make even one mistake, then it's all downhill from there. And so this, of course, has been operating underneath the surface for a long time for me. And so it would show up in a lot of different ways, social anxieties and maybe being too attuned to other people and being like, oh, am I matching the standards enough? Am I being perfect enough? Am I showing up the right way enough? And so when it came to sitting with these sensations of fear, that was basically my doorway into this part of myself that I had repressed. And being able to see that, I was able to become conscious of what it was really going through. And so many things have shifted since I had that ceremony because I was able to access that part of myself. Now, the medicine helped, but it's not necessary to actually have a medicine experience to have this type of integration. You can just focus on those sensations in the body body that have been repressed, those emotions, those traumas that haven't been worked through, and then those can give you direct access to parts of yourself that you've pushed away into the shadow. All right, so the fourth reason why we repress parts of ourselves and put them in the shadow is because these aspects are dealing with unmet needs. And so let's say, for example, that somebody has an unmet need for validation as a child. And let's say that they happen to be raised in a family situation where they're just never going to get that validation because it just happens to be not a function that the parents have maybe integrated in some way. And so what the child at that point knows on some level, not consciously perhaps, is that, ooh, I can keep needing this need and not get it met and feel all this desperation and all these other things, or I can numb myself out to the part of myself that has this need, and then I can continue going on about my business and, really not even be aware that I have this need in the first place. Now, of course, these needs still play themselves out in unconscious ways underneath the surface, but at least it's not associated with the intensity of the desperation around having like that need for something that's not going to be met externally. And so in order to integrate an aspect that's repressed due to unmet needs, you have to, number one, become aware that there's an unmet need there, which is challenging because if we've never had that need met, we might not even realize that we have a need there because we don't have any sense of contrast there to compare it to. So it's almost like if you go into a room and you've never been in that room before and chairs are missing, but you never saw the chairs there to begin with, you don't know that something's missing from the room. So you have to become aware that you have the need, and then you have to meet that need. And you want to work from the inside out when you do this. So from the inside, what that means is if there are any internal barriers to meeting that need, parts of the self that are unreceptive to having that need met, it can be a little bit like, let's say as a metaphor, let's imagine that there's a cup and the cup has a hole in it. So even if that need is being poured directly into you from the outside, and that, let's say the cup is covered over or there's a hole in the cup and now all the liquid is pouring out of it, then you're not going to be able to get that need met. So you want to work from the inside out. You want to work on the internal barriers to having that need met, and then you want to actually seek an external situation that actually gives you that need and meets that need. All right, so that's in a nutshell how you actually integrate a shadow aspect, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. Also, check out my husband's movie, Room Zero. And until next time, keep becoming more you.